1, 2, 3.
Perfect, thank you.
Right. So, as I indicated earlier, I have come back and again I intend to spend a bit more time paying attention to contracting and how it works. Partly because, as it turns out, contracting really matters, but also because I have at least learned so much about how to do good commissioning through a whole lot of the lessons that flow out of contracting. As I said earlier on, one of the benefits that people in the private sector have over public providers of public services is that they have permission to say, that's mad, I'm not going to do it, or that's mad, let's talk about it a bit more. They haven't always been doing that, and so I did this report which I entitled Just Another Paperclip for the Business Services Association that was published in March this year. And it's led me back to paying a bit more attention to this, and I'm going to do some more work on this going forward. So this is sort of a taster for where I think that work is going to go. This is the next presentation, and Benjamin asked me if I would concentrate on these particular themes in some of the presentation.
There's a pop-up, sorry, on the screen. Some tech thing has gone up on the screen. Look.
There we go.
It's gone now.
So how does contracting work? Have you got any thoughts? When contracting works, what's going on? What might, other than the one I just told you, what might happen that might enable a contracted service to work better than something that was done under a traditional model? Any thoughts?
More clarity on what's required.
So why?
Through the specification, the formality of the process.
Okay, so, yep, and because you're handing off to an outsider, you've got to clarify things that historically maybe you didn't need to. Mm-hmm.
Clear accountability.
You want to unpack that a bit more?
Well, I'm just wondering if you contract something out, and you've specified what it is, then the person you've contracted to is accountable for delivering whatever it is they're supposed to deliver. My experience in the NHS is that it's not always clear who's accountable for what, because we're accountable to develop plans and deliver plans, but then of course the organisation above us will inspect them and kick us along the way. So really, is it us or them who's accountable for those plans?
Yes, I recognise that.
Delineation, isn't it?
Yep.
Greater flexibility.
Sorry?
Greater flexibility.
Okay, so of what kind? You just want to unpack that a bit more?
It may be the organisation you're contracting with doesn't have to follow the same kind of processes or brings new ways of doing things, greater innovation than perhaps the existing organisation would be able to bring.
And why might that be? Why might an external provider have more freedom?
It depends on the model. It may be they've got more legislative freedom around certain things. It could also be just greater perspective. They come to it fresh and have got a kind of new way of doing it, or they've got others that they work with. There are economies of scale.
Okay.
Penalties and incentives.
Sorry?
Penalties and incentives. You can
Consequences.
Yeah.
And presumably rewards.
And rewards
as well.
Yes.
It's a live document, so it can flex as well. So in terms of change.
But wouldn't you think command and control management would have more flexibility? Aren't contracts a bit rigid?
Not necessarily. It depends how they're worked out. I think it depends on the nature of the work as well. If you want it to be flexible, you should have the option.
Okay. Well, I've had the benefit of thinking about this a little longer. So let me sort of organise this under a range of different headings. I think there's several things going on, and some others that I don't know that we've necessarily bottomed out. So some of what's going on is because of competition or contestability. Some of what's going on is because of the process of contracting. Some of it is because you've got a private entity or a commercial entity involved. And as I said, there's some other questions I have about other possible things. Now I have drawn this over some years from a variety of different sources, and there really isn't a literature that deals with this. So let's look at competition. One of the things that's going on is that the process of competition is a process of discovery. Now, in the marketplace, it's haggling. We are establishing something we didn't know before, which is what is my price threshold. When you're doing a competitive tender, you are forcing the providers, well, you're firstly ascertaining, you're thinking a lot more carefully about what it is you want. So as you as a commissioner or you as a purchaser, if it's only that bit of your responsibility, you're thinking through much more clearly, what is it I actually want here? And often that's not been done before. There's sort of a discovery on the demand side going on. But providers, as long as they've got a monopoly, have got no incentive to reveal what the true cost of providing a service is. I mean, why would they go to all that effort? But often they simply won't know what the true cost of providing that service is because no one's ever pushed them. They've never been challenged to do it. So I use this is an example from the New South Wales Correctional and Space again, where as we're challenging, and this is not the market tested prison where the in-house team won, this is the publicly provided public prisons where we've challenged them through a benchmarking and contestability process. And as part of that honest conversation, some of the providers, some of the governors and their teams, because the governors are often involving their people right down to the frontline staff in the process of developing their solutions, and they've said, you know, if we could just put in a couple of CCTV cameras, we could save a number of positions. That's not a proposition that they'd explored before. And of course it relies heavily. You could send an outside expert in, but an outside expert would have to take a bit of time to understand the trade-offs between safety and saving. I mean, there's a risk management issue here that is really heavily dependent on local knowledge, on contextual knowledge. And so there's a process of discovery going on as people say, well, we could do that differently. One of the interesting things in this video that I'll show next week is some of the staff who are involved in this saying, I was sort of learning how this prison works and the way we could trade off efficiencies in a way that I'd never done it before, because this particular governor involved staff in coming up with a solution. And they were looking outside of the particular set of responsibilities that they normally had in their day-to-day job. They were looking at the totality, and that came up. The governor actually put in a submission to the committee he'd established, and they rejected most of what he put forward. And came up with their own solutions, and he's on camera saying, and actually they were right, they came up with better solutions. Now that kind of a discovery process is one of the things that happens when you've got that. Now you could hypothesise a world where we could replicate that without the benefit of that challenge. Now this, as I said, this is not an outsourcing, this is the public sector doing it within a challenge environment. Now you might be able to have management consultants come in and do it. I do wonder though whether it would be as effective as having a committee of the staff sitting down and working through how they could most optimally trade off. Because in some places it meant more staff in some functions and fewer staff in others. It wasn't just, you know, across the board cuts. There was working out how to optimise this in order to produce the best results. So this is, some of what's going on is discovery. Motivation. An open tender demands that competing providers develop solutions under conditions where they know that other experienced providers are developing solutions to the same specifications at the same time. And this here is, with the exception of a couple of ring-ins, that's the Commissioner of Corrections, and that's me there, and that's the Minister. The rest of them were the bid team that put forward the winning in-house bid. And it was interesting to talk to them, and we're actually going to go in and do a proper deep interview with them. But they did what I observed Serco people were doing. They spent a lot of time together in confined spaces working through solutions, alternative solutions, knowing that they really had to come up with something pretty clever, because there were three other private providers elsewhere in the town at that time, had a lot of experience in bidding, who were sitting there working out how to come up with a smarter solution. And this is a great opportunity to discover, and we don't do it very often, don't do it often enough, where a public team were permitted to sit down and go through that process. And I want to unpack what was happening there. But they were motivated, and they came up with some really innovative solutions, which is how they were able to win. Matching. Competition is a search process, and if you use it well, it can be used for commissioners and providers to seek each other out and decide whether they want to establish a relationship. The word matching comes from employment contracting, and of course it's borrowed from the field of choosing a partner, someone to live with. And if you're choosing a new chief executive or a new person for a key position within your organisation, you would not put an ad in the paper with basic specifications and then say lowest price accepted. Okay, we're doing something much more complex, aren't we, when we're hiring a key member of a team? We're eyeballing each other, and we're deciding, both sides are deciding, are we right for each other? And it's not, some of the matching literature makes the point, it's not that you can rank everyone according to obvious criteria. Some of it's just, I think this person's going to fit into this organisation better at this moment than that other person. It is about a process of matching. Good competition, good procurement for complex services and complex tasks is doing that. It's searching for a match, and both sides are doing it. They're both eyeing each other off and deciding, is this going to be a good relationship? Now, some of the things that we've seen go bad, particularly I think in recent years, that wasn't going on anymore on both sides. There was not enough of that going on. But done well, when it leads to success. I've just had a case, I won't say what it was, but on Friday in Oxford, talking to this ring-in who dropped in to sort of the 3 or 4 hours of exchanges we had, talking about a really interesting transportation contract in London where they spent 6 months building trust before they went to the procurement. Interesting. And I so badly want to unpack that and say, who thought of that? Where did that idea come from? How did you do that? How did you, I know where the value lay, why they went down that path, because of the complexity of the particular task that they were wanting to contract for. Diversity. It may matter more that new entrants are different than that they're the same, or that they have the expertise you're looking for. And this comes from this research by James G. March, an organisational theorist, who pointed out that committees of experts and amateurs are better at solving problems usually than committees of experts. Because committees of experts already know how to solve the problem. Everyone knows it. Whereas the amateurs in the room, amateurs to the particular specific task, the amateurs go, excuse me, but why would you do it that way? And my case study on this is a prisons one again, and it's from here. The first contract prison in the UK was the Walls, Her Majesty's Prison, the Walls, which was run by Group 4, Scandinavian company. And 30% of the prison officers, when this is a male prison, 30% of the prison officers when that prison opened were female in a male prison. The average at the time in the public sector was about 2%. And as one of the prison governors I've spoken to from that time said to me, and he said, and some of them were men, he said, I had one that used to smoke a pipe. So it was a very male culture. 2% women in a male prison run with the other 98% of prison officers male. The women aren't going to be contributing too much to the culture. Now, one of the things that it did is that it instantly transformed the culture in a male prison. Suddenly, I mean, if I rough up a bloke, a male prison officer, I can look tough. I'm not going to look terribly tough roughing up a female prison officer. Although I'm told this has become a bit more of a problem recently because of some of the drugs that are coming into prisons is not necessarily that respect. But for 3 decades, it has had this huge effect of altering the climate, the atmosphere in male prisons. And I said to I went out and I interviewed the people, they were mostly retired by that point, the people who'd been the senior management in Group 4 at the time, and they had ex-prison governors advising them. But I said, what was the logic behind having 30% female prison officers? Take me through the process. They said, we just conducted our normal selection process and 30% of the people who came up qualified best were female. Didn't occur to us. Now I'm sure they checked with the experienced prison governors, but it didn't occur to them. Hadn't crossed their mind that you couldn't have a male prison where 30% of the prison officers were female. That proposition was not something they were carrying already loaded in. So it's possible that some of the big difference that, to take this example, that the private sector were able to make in prisons from the 80s, in the 80s, late 80s, 90s and 2000s was simply that they were coming at it with a completely fresh way of thinking about it. It never occurred to them that you would do it the old way. And indeed, government used them that way. The government, just before, coincidentally, they began to involve the private sector, had borrowed a new method of designing and running prisons from the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the US, and it was about normalising the prison environment. The theory was if we didn't have the sort of, the landings model of prisons that you all remember from Porridge, if we actually had open association spaces, and this is more open, and people could socialise with each other and there were spaces they could sort of play and sit and deal with each other. If it wasn't so strange, then perhaps readjustment back into society wouldn't be so difficult. That was the basic hypothesis. There was some evidence to support it. And the unions here, they built the prisons and the unions said we're not going to go in and associate with the prisoners because it requires you to walk around and associate with the prisoners through the day. And we're not going to call prisoners by their first name. Where the prison companies, when they came in, said, oh, okay, if that's what you want. It never occurred to them. They weren't recruiting old prison officers. They were hiring new people. It never occurred to them. So it was one of those places where perhaps people coming in who just had a different way, could think about the problem in a completely different way because they weren't embedded steeply, they weren't steeped in the traditions and the ways of doing things. So it may well be that there's some places where competition does that. And mandate. The process of winning a competition bestows on management a right to make changes, and that happens even when it's the in-house team that wins. They have a mandate. This here is a photo from when the Commissioner for Corrections went out to John Moroney Correctional Centre, the one that had been market tested, and the in-house team had won. And this is the Chief Operating Officer who had led it and other members of the team. This is the union official. You notice we've won. This is their preferred bidder at this stage. He feels good about what's happened. There's a shift in thinking that's occurred, not only on the part of management who are thrilled, but on the part of the staff and the union. A shift has occurred. And commitment. So this is just continuing to borrow this example. The process of deliberately choosing a partner and formally signing a contract imposes new obligations on both parties. So that's the minister on the left there, the commissioner, and then this is the guy who led, the chief operating officer for the prison system who led the bid. And the commissioner closed off conversation about this during the process of the bid, so they had ethical walls in place. There's a commitment made here. And one of the consequences of that is that as Treasury set about to try to find efficiencies or cut spending, this will be protected because there's an agreement being signed. They have got to deliver they have committed to deliver certain results, and they've been reassured of certain time and certain resources, certain money in order to do that. And if it were a contract with a private provider, that commitment you wouldn't be going and cutting their budget because there's a contract. This document isn't a contract. Government can't contract with itself. It is an agreement. It's protected. There's a level of commitment here, and that needs to be honoured. And it's crucial to delivering the better services they've been asked to do at a lower cost, that they have time and they have a reassurance about the resources they'll need to do the job. Do stop me at...
On that point,
Yeah.
We've all seen plenty of examples of the reverse, actually, because there is a commitment made at that point, but if you've bought the wrong thing, you've locked in the wrong thing at the wrong price for a long time.
Yep.
And that frequently happens.
Okay. And it's conceivable that government might need to reduce spending as well, in which case you have a grown-up conversation about adjusting what it is that's to be delivered at the cost. It's not just a unilateral, you've got 20% less for your current budget, or 5% less, or whatever it is, or we're just going to slash small capital work spending because because the judges want it. That there has got to be, and yes, you do need to be able to renegotiate these things, but it's got to be a grown-up discussion that says, let's say you're getting less spending, getting less money, we will alter our expectations about what we're asking you to deliver. Or we've changed the nature of what it is we want you to deliver, and let's have a grown-up conversation about the resources that are necessary, more or less, in order to deliver that. So it is, yes, the world does change. Or we didn't anticipate the world being quite as it turned out to be.
Or there's another option there, which is we need to find X amount of savings, how do we work together to achieve it? Which is different, which can sit uneasily in a contractual relationship.
Yep. But the benefit of that is that there is a commitment, and someone has permission, authority, to put their hand up and say, you need to talk to me about that. You need my permission to talk. And I think that the public sector should be in a position to be able to have that conversation too. I appreciate the world has changed. Let's talk about what that means for what it is you're asking me to deliver. And we don't normally do that. We treat the people who deliver like children, and we can just chop off the spending. And they.
That was the point I was trying to make earlier about having it as a live document, to have the honesty to be able to agree changes and
Yeah. Yep. Now on contracting, I think contracting is doing some work that competition doesn't, and I'm drawing here on the first piece of research that I had one of my people do at the Serco Institute when I took over. And this was a scoping study. We had 13 public contract managers in defence support, prisons and health support, hospital support, who used to do a similar job in government. Same people, same job, different framework, and we said, tell us about what's different about those two environments. We went on to do some quant work. No one was ever interested in the quant study. This was so powerful. It was actually probably the most influential report we ever did, because these people, we heard their voice, they spoke. and it was really wonderfully insightful. Now, I'll unpack a little bit more, but essentially it comes down to purpose, authority and accountability is what contracting is doing. Now, our reports were all public. You can find that online if you know where to find it. If you can't and you're interested, I can send you a copy. All of our stuff was published, but I went back to Serco and I said, you realise it's probable that a lot of what you're doing has got little to do with you being the private sector or you being Serco. It has to do with the fact that when you sign a contract with government, your people get given permission to do a whole lot of, and the freedom to do a whole lot of things, and they're placed in a situation where they've got to do a whole lot of things that wasn't the case when they were employed by government. So purpose, formally negotiating agreement with the provider serves to clarify the mission. And mission, I use the word mission, I won't sort of go into it in great detail, I use the word mission quite deliberately. So this is quoting from this report, one of the contract managers. The contract is based on achieving certain targets and it gives greater clarity and focus on those. I've got a focus that I feel I didn't have when I did this within the public sector. Stability. A contract ensures that management knows how they will be judged 5 years in the future, 2 years, 5 years in the future, and what resources they will have in order to meet those, to be ready for that judgment. You know years in advance how you'll be judged. You do things always thinking, what impact is this going to have on the outcomes? This is this former public servant describing what it's like to operate in a contractual environment. Understanding. Clarity about outcomes and the expectation of consequences drives a search for understanding. Because of the contract, we have to report a lot of information, but that information is also useful for me. Not only does it drive the performance of the contract, it also drives me to take managerial action and to provide management focus. Again, these are not just one-off quotes. I sort of selected one. These came through repeatedly in the people that we spoke to. They're having to generate management information because there's going to be a consequence if they don't understand the connections between interventions, inputs and results. Authority. Winning a competition and signing a contract creates space within which management has authority and discretion to act. I wound up calling this, I talked about the shield of the contract, and I talk about management space. It really was one of those striking insights. This is just one of many quotes. The ability to respond quickly is brilliant. The key is really that we have the freedom to innovate. This is what it comes down to. I, as a manager, if I need to hire somebody to do it, I can move quickly. To go back to this example, they're having trouble finding money in the minor capital works budget, which has been trimmed, to invest. The ratio of savings here is like 10 to 1. 10 times annually to the investment. But the minor capital works budget's been trimmed. And so, again, we're talking about honest conversations. If you can't do that, don't ask them to significantly reduce that. But if you don't have that, don't do that. Don't do that if you can't do that. And one of the things I said in one of the meetings was, you realise this is one of the advantages that a contractor has. They'll just go and find that money. It's not much money. And the savings just outweigh it so much year to year, I mean annually, let alone over its lifetime. It is one of those things, and again, coming through in the quotes we got from this Good People, Good Systems report, we need to spend that money, and let's do it. My point in this is that this oughtn't be confined to the private sector, right? I mean, I just refuse to accept that this is something that we can't get right for the public sector. I just don't accept that. Accountability. Accountability is more effective when management have clarity and stability around the outcomes and the authority to deliver. I have much greater managerial autonomy, but the consequences are that I can't blame anyone else. what struck me, my father was a small businessman. What struck me when we spoke, well, I listened to these people because most of the interviewing was done by one of my staff, was that the language and the way they spoke about their relationship to the contract was very like my father's business. This sense of responsibility and ownership. And you do see that in the public sector, but it stood out, and they said it was, they commented on how much more that was so. And then consequences, and we'll talk a bit more about consequences. Accountability is a much more effective tool of management when the consequences for performance are proportionate and predictable. If you don't achieve your KPIs in the public sector, you can trot out a load of excuses. Here you get heavily fined. It does focus the mind. This consequences point is enormously important. It's one of the things that is missing in public-to-public commissioning, and we'll come back on it later on. Commercialisation, I think there's a couple of things where conceivably, now again, I don't know that we couldn't, if we didn't try, we couldn't rectify these, but it's possible that there are some things that private ownership just helps on. Transfer of best practice, I think there's some evidence, that international public service providers may have a greater capacity to capture and transfer best practice. Government isn't terrific at capturing and transferring best practice. We do it in medical technology really well. We don't do it anywhere near as well in the management technologies in the NHS, and that is and they actually steal from each other. I mean, they're actually, people leave one company and go to another, and they don't necessarily steal legally owned intellectual property. There's still ways of thinking about it, or ways of bringing together solutions. Scaling up. Public sector has real problems scaling up from really successful, one-offs to, and part of this, there's a bit of a literature on this. Part of the difficulty is that in the public sector there's a tendency to want to scale up to everyone immediately, and one of the benefits of having sort of multiple firms, and you could do this within the public sector, is that you can scale up in part, and if they get it wrong, you're not failing the whole system. So this is a sort of really interesting problem, this scaling up problem of scaling up success. Reputational capital. There are real benefits in having a well-defined brand and having people who've invested money in a brand. And I use Arnott's, which is an Australian biscuit company. It's sort of I don't know what British biscuit company would occupy quite the space that Arnott's does, because Arnott's really had all the iconic old biscuits, all of them. And this is 20 years old now, but they had a food poisoning scandal, and they just immediately pulled everything from every shelf. Cost them a fortune in order to deal with the issue. And at the end result, they spent a lot of money, and the Australian public did not thank them for it, because that was what they expected Arnott's to do. They had already banked the huge respect and trust that Australians had in Arnott's. That was banked decades ago. It was banked, their mum and dad had banked that reputation. All they did was leave things as they were, and for me it was just a profound insight into how powerful brand can be, and why it's worth, if you own something, a brand that's worth something, why you would spend a lot of resource getting it right and preserving it, even when it wasn't your fault at all. Brand can do a lot of work. But the public sector just seems to, I mean, we have a few brands, but the BBC is a very strong brand, and they've had some challenges to that brand over the last couple of years with some in various ways. They really understand it, they've done research on it, they know the value of that brand, but by and large in the public sector we have trouble using brand as a tool, and it can be extraordinarily powerful. And then financial capital. This is my point about, some cases about the CCTV cameras. In some cases, private providers may have an advantage because they have ready access to investment capital. And again, I just can't imagine that that's a problem we couldn't conceivably fix with some good design within the public sector. And then finally, let me just talk about a couple of others. And these are just things that I have reflected on as I have studied this closely over the years. I think in some cases, sometimes the benefits of contracting just come because there's a fresh start. You're just restarting things, and there is some research that indicates that within an organisation, say within the NHS or within the education system or within the prison system, you can actually achieve quite a few of these benefits if you can find a mechanism for sort of a fundamental restart. It's not that we were going, using contracting or necessarily going to an outside provider. It was just the fact of a fresh start. And there possibly is a selection effect. I think some of what was happening with contracting in prisons was that it was attracting a whole lot of the really good prison managers across to the private companies because they would have the freedom to do really interesting stuff. And so it was selecting out a whole lot of good people. It was a hothouse effect, selecting out a whole lot of good innovative people from out of the public system. And so it may be that some of what's going on is that with contracting is that there's sort of a selection effect going on. Questions, comments about that? Does that make sense? Do you recognise that? Yeah.
No.
Sorry?
No, actually. I don't. I recognise the aspiration. I recognise the theoretical benefits that you're describing, and I'm thinking, why is the practice and the outcome so often very different from what you're describing? So the benefits that you're describing are not achieved. And I'm thinking about accountability in particular, and actually I think quite a lot of large-scale contracts where accountability is successfully avoided because it might be how it's procured, or it might be how the other parts, the moving parts of the system aren't moving as were expected. And then I'm thinking about the point of brands at the end, whereby most of the large outsourcing companies in this country at least have really bad brands.
They do now.
Yeah,
that's a good example actually of where brand has been used to spectacular
G4S
effect.
And the
Serco
and the Serco, they're all trouble, and they're all in. So I suppose that's my question really, is I get the rhetoric, I get the theory. Why is the practice so different?
Well, I think it's practice in recent years, and if you read just another paperclip, you'll see some of the reasons why I think that's occurred. I mean, one of them is that this became about a race to the bottom. This became aggressively about price, and one of my conclusions in just another paperclip was that, surprising probably to a lot of people, that I think when governments are under severe financial stress, they probably should not use competitive tendering, because it is such a powerful tool for driving down price that whenever you use it, you have got to have very strong countervailing pressures to keep quality built in. And I think what happened here was that the government, which felt it needed to save a lot of money quickly, began to push even harder on that accelerator, and the capacity for there to be a countervailing, a pushback was lost. So much so, and I won't breach confidences, but senior civil servants who said to me that essentially that their primary mission, these are people responsible for contracting, public service contracting, that their primary mission was to save money. Now I think in those circumstances, as I said, competitive tendering is auctions are a phenomenally powerful tool for reducing price. Part of the assumption, I think, that when I talk about this in the report, part of the assumption, I think, on the part of many public servants was that the private sector's self-interest would act as a countervailing force, and that if they pushed hard, that the private sector would push back, and I have a section in there, again, it's sort of, again, I think groundbreaking work. I don't know of anyone who's done as much work on it, where I go through about 8 reasons why it is for a time the private sector may actually do things that will damage their brand or risk their brand. And so the commissioner or the procurement official needs to understand the dynamics of that system in order not to break it. And that this system has come very, very close to breaking, which is why I, at no cost, at my cost, I did the research for that report and wrote it, because it was just a wonderful opportunity for me to go in and speak to a whole lot of people, particularly on the private sector side, to say, why did you do that? So, yeah, I mean, these tools need to be understood, but there was a long time in a lot of sectors where a whole lot of this stuff was going on. So this is, why does this stuff work when it works well, and what might we learn from that? What can we learn from when, you know, what happens when this stuff is done well that we could replicate inside the public sector? That's the, because the solution, the answer can't be, we can't replicate it. I just refuse to accept that's the answer. We've just got to accept all of that inefficiency. Sorry, yeah.
I think you can, but I think it's about innovative thinking. I think a lot of the things you do, particularly in local authority, from my experience, is because it's historical. We've always done it that way, and you come up against. Some of my colleagues I know have left the public sector for private sector, not maybe the larger providers that made mistakes, but they have said things. For instance, our statutory duties. They put us in a box because we have to deliver this and we've got to deliver that, but we haven't got the money to do it. So we do have to look at costs. Whereas the private sector don't have those constraints. We also have to deliver to elected members. So we might say we're going to do this for 2 years. However, if an election happens, we're not going to be doing that. And like you mentioned, things like consistency and frequency, those make for good contracts. So we suffer in that respect. And I think it's just about being innovative in terms of there must be some agreement at a higher level. Some of our elected members are coming round to that, and we're doing things in a much different way. Until you get to that level, we're not even interesting to some providers, particularly the voluntary sector, who do things better than we do. And we would want to do that, but because of the way we let our contracts, they're not really interested in coming to us. So I think it has to be just a change of that thought process. When you talk about motivation and all those other things, we really lack in those areas. And I think the good thing is that we're now identifying that, whereas historically it was okay because we're a local authority.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I think it's often seen as a process, simple as that. So contracting is a process. So there's often not the room for innovation, actual thinking, getting people to think. But it's often more of a machine.
So there's I agree, and I'll come on to this in the next lecture, but there's a tendency to think either in terms of models. So we pick up alliance contracting, and we pick up SIBs, or we pick up PPPs or PFI, whatever. We sort of pick up whole things. And the procurement discipline has tended to think, they haven't seen themselves as having permission to think about contract design. What's my problem, and what range of tools do I have that I might bring to actually have a competition for and then to contract for this particular set of problems in this particular environment? And so that toolkit approach of what's the problem here, and what do I design for this? And I mean, you were saying earlier on that often this stuff's sort of handed down by the gods, and you're not given freedom to...
No, and then we have some highly prescribed machine-like procurement process where you don't, where you said earlier, it's about matching. Yeah. Well, the assumption is we know what we want as the customer. Yeah. But and when you talk about trying to find a partner, it reminds me of when I joined a dating website, for example, and I thought I knew the kind of woman I was looking for, and I had this idea of who she was, and actually the woman I found and fell in love with was completely different to that, you know. But I think there's something for that in our you don't know what you want until you see it, in a way. And I think that's true with suppliers, providers. You don't know what they can do until you really get into dialogue with them. And our procurement processes are so mechanical and done through these online portals that you don't get the opportunity for that discussion space. You have a very tight specification, you put it out, people come back and you do some scoring process, and then hey, presto, that's who you engage with. You know,
It's a sausage machine.
yeah.
So I mean, not for a moment. If you read my Paperclips report, you'll see not for a moment do I suggest that this is always done well, but there are lots and lots of examples of where this has been done well. And I guess for me, yes, you can learn from the failures too, but we can actually learn a lot from the successes and begin to sort of unpack what is it about this that works. Because it's not a black box. It won't always work if you just stick it in the sausage machine.
I think one of the problems, which I can't remember if it's explicit in your Paperclips report, we'll send round references to both reports you've referenced to participants. I've just tweeted them out. Is that companies see brand value as an asset to be as capital that can be both built up and spent. And I've seen that explicitly being in parts of Capita, for example. I.e., once you've got a decent brand to a decent point, you can make money on it by running down the brand value, getting away with some things based on your previously earned value. It's a calculation.
That's true. That's true.
Yes, let's not name too many names on the video. So sorry. But one thing I'm interested in is you touched on it around the allegation that we're indulging in policy thinking in a sense, and we have to make this real for practitioners, for commissioners in the field in that complexity. You have a sort of stated preference for academic thinking and rigour, I think. But I do think there are a lot of
reflective thinking.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's... So, for example, I've been to a number of supplier consultation events for Cabinet Office programmes, delivering differently the mutual support programme and the like. And a lot of people in the room from all kinds of consultancies and suppliers have said exactly the kind of thing that we've just been talking about, and the Cabinet Office have tried to listen. They are intelligent, capable, but inexperienced people usually in these programmes. Is there a way that we can tap into... So there's a lot of practitioner knowledge out there, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
There is.
And a lot of it's in consultants as well, who are prepared to be quite open about some of these issues. Is there a way that we, as the PSTA in particular, can tap into that and share it more widely?
And answering, sort of thinking about Paul's question over break, I made the comment that I think another problem that you have that we don't have to the same extent in Australia and New Zealand is there's too much churn. People go through jobs too quickly, and you certainly see that in Cabinet Office here. People are in post for 2 years. If 3 years is a long time, and I think that's got to stop. You can't build up serious expertise in a seriously complex area if you're not in that role for a period of time. I did the New South Wales, chaired the New South Wales inquiry into point-to-point transportation, the ride-sharing problem, and had a briefing from the team. We reported almost 2 years ago. Had a brief from the team the day before I climbed on a plane, and I was the woman who supported my team, who is now the point-to-point transportation commissioner, and is implementing the stuff we developed as a team, had been in post for responsible for the policy in that area for probably 5 years before that. She's got serious domain knowledge, and she's also had a set of conversations in various environments so that she can't be easily worked round or bluffed. And that kind of, that is a particular example, but that's not unusual. And I certainly in the central agencies here, I don't see that deep long-term investment in these skills. You do wind up with people. I think some of the bigger Whitehall departments have moved people on way too quickly. Others, and we were talking earlier on, defence is one where there has been a deeper investment, but I still don't know that there has been the reflection on what's learned and a capturing of what's learned and a extracting of the lessons. So I talk about tools, and I think there's a certain amount of ideology that still washes round amongst the politicians. A lot of it is just fashion or faddishness rather than ideology per se. And people sort of discovered PFI, and then they discovered social impact bonds and so on. They became a fad. And so you'll see in the next slides after we've had a break. I mean, I'm extraordinarily interested in the tools. I want to sort of unpack the tools, what lies underneath this that enables you to reach into a toolbox and pull, that saying, if the only tool you've got is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. That's actually Abraham Maslow who said that. And when you realise it's Maslow who said it, you sort of pause for a little bit longer. It's an extraordinarily powerful point that says, basically, my capacity to understand the problem in front of me is constrained by the repertoire of tools that I have available in my toolbox. Now, not a tool kit. I didn't go and buy it at the shop. It's something I assembled over a lifetime of experience. And I know when I encounter that kind of a problem that I've got a range of tools I could draw on to deal with that particular problem. It's an extraordinarily important point. And I think a lot when we come to this, I mean, and sadly, too much of the teaching that we do around this, we need to do the teaching of procurement as a technical skill, but we're not teaching people to think flexibly about what particular model or what particular set of tools would I draw on to deal with this problem, because this problem's different from that one over there. It's not the same problem. So that, I do think we've got to invest in that. Sorry, Paul, you?
No, it strikes me that there's a theme in the talk so far has been a low level or a lack of awareness of this as a lack of capacity or capability around the area. And your quote by Maslow just reminded me of a bit of research, and I will circulate the link. But it sounds like pop psychology, but it has been proven, is the idea that you can only be aware of how good you are at doing something. It's a function of how good you are at it. So, i.e., the better you get at something, the more aware you become at your previous lack of competence, but also how far you've got to go insofar as developing those skills. So it may also be that sort of a situation insofar as we don't know how far we have to go because we haven't. This is all quite nascent.
Yeah, we've been at this for a long time. There's still an awful lot you can. Some of the most insightful learning I did on this was going back through old Department of Defence reports in America about the A-76 procurements. They were pretty, sort of an old-fashioned, clunky old thing, but they studied a lot, and you just get different insights in. And these are applied. They're not sitting back in an ivory tower thinking about how contracting works theoretically. They're going down and studying a particular contract and interviewing people and unpacking the learnings from that. So there's still an awful lot to be learned from going out and looking at some of the older studies. So probably the best study I know in contracting is a defence contract in New Zealand, a base support contract. It was warehousing and logistics and workshop. And some academics came in there'd been a good solid study by the New Zealand Ministry of Defence before it was done, so they had good data on the counterfactual, good understanding of the counterfactual, and the academics came in and studied it while it was being transitioned and transformed, and they were then able to sort of unpack what was going on, what was happening here that enabled things to be done better at a lower cost. So they were sort of unpacking very granular information and able to study it as it occurred. As a piece of methodology, I would recommend lots more of that sort of thing. So it's academics doing what a good academic's good at, which is, reflecting, analysing, unpacking, seeing, underlying issues and wider patterns and trends, but working in real time with practitioners as they did it to see what's happening. And it's a hugely, they're using statistical analysis to sort of crunch numbers at the same time, so it's good solid research. That's just been done so rarely. We have just done that kind of analysis is just not been done anywhere near enough.
It's the transfer which is what.
Sorry?
So the learning has happened, but it's been captured and isolated. It hasn't been shared.
Yeah. The story has to be, the case has to be written up. There has to be a place where that case can go to be taught. But there's also the process of extracting the sort of generic lesson from it. As it were, the history of the world in 100 objects or whatever. He makes the point about the first one, which is a stone tool, that humans are not different in that we use tools. There are birds and animals who invent and use tools. We're different in that we have toolboxes. We put it aside with the thought to coming back and solving a similar or slightly different problem in the future. And it's that relationship with the toolbox that I think is interesting, and which we're not doing. We're sort of, if you like, we keep picking up tools, but there's not we do it at a very micro, specific level around procurement, sort of in a very mechanical way. We're not doing it that next level back about thinking about the problem in front of us and how do we actually deal with this particular problem. What suite of solutions do I bring to have an appropriate solution for that?
I refer you to two complex diagrams on the wall to your left-hand side. That is actually what Red Quadrant of the BSTA I think is substantively trying to do. It's a hard sell though, because it's not a miracle solution to anything.
It costs money. I think we tend to throw our tools away. In terms of expertise, capability, capacity, that is within staff, for instance, where you look to make redundancies to save money, but you're throwing away some of your most expensive tools in doing so. And I call it my idiot's guide to savings. So if you have a project that's hemorrhaging, say 240,000, and you're thinking that your managers over there are too expensive, that could be 3 managers, and that expertise would be thrown away if you were to look at better ways, more efficient ways of delivering a service that maybe generated income. You would have saved the staff and the money, but a lot of times you don't see it that way in terms of even bringing in people like you're saying with the expertise to do some reflective thinking, or practitioners. We don't always, I don't think we don't, but I think we can't afford to do it too often. Or we can't afford to retain certain staff.
Yeah, but as I said, somebody pointed out to me, if you just took a fraction of the money that we've wasted on
That's why I said
disastrous procurements, just a fraction of it.
That is the hemorrhaging I'm talking about, because it's a lot of our services.
And if we invested just a proportion of that in retained expertise and built expertise, we could have, we would be saving. But that's.
Can I ask, how many transformations in the public sector actually get embedded and stuck with? Because my experience tells me that there's the cycle bit. Every 10 years we go through a process of transformation, for want of better words. We never embed. We get 70% of the way there. Someone goes, that's been a roaring success. Let's move on to the next one. And we start the process again.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I'm just trying to think of his name. I always forget his name. Shelley Metzenbaum's husband, I always remember him. Shelley Metzenbaum was Obama's performance guru from Harvard, and her husband, whose name will come to me in a minute, wrote a book on US federal government IT procurement in the 80s, and then was brought in by Al Gore to a senior role in the Federal Procurement Service, and after he left wrote a report called Unleashing Change, and he the book really is about how the transformation of the US Federal Procurement Service, and he makes 2 points. I won't burden you with the other one. One of them is, he said, transformation reform is like a flywheel. Once you've got it, it's really hard to get moving, but once you've got it moving, you just need to tap it occasionally. But he said we keep stopping and starting flywheels, and so there's huge amounts of effort that goes into starting flywheels. When if we could just get some things that would be. Look, I think in some places part of the role of the commissioner is to find bipartisan space, is to find solutions and models that will fall into a place where both sides can own it. And I think if what you're wanting to do is to have stuff that isn't stop-start, then finding spaces and solutions that go into a place where both sides are going to feel comfortable with what's happening, and you're not going to have that. In Canada, in my first commissioning academy I taught there, we were one of the people in the course was working in juvenile justice, and she said, because we taught it, we had a sort of a day or so in between, and she said, come across and look what we're doing, and I do sometimes teach from this material. They had developed a set of outcomes working with, this is an industry that is partly publicly provided and partly provided by not-for-profits. And obviously academics have an investment in the space of juvenile justice. And they negotiated a set of outcomes and then a set of measures associated with those outcomes for reducing reoffending amongst young offenders. They still hadn't sort of put a peg in the wall and said, and this is the standard that you should reach. And that had taken them about 3 years to negotiate that. And they had done it without any ministerial cover. They had just done it as good civil servants, engaging with their stakeholders and community. And I suspect that any minister coming in would have to have an awful lot of chutzpah to override something that had been deeply negotiated and established as a shared position in terms of what are the outcomes we want to achieve. And that's tricky business to work out, useful, functional outcomes. And then what are the things we would, how would we measure whether or not we were, and that got there. And so I think it's a good example of a sort of a good civil service performing the role that they should perform, which is finding a space where there can be some stability, where we don't have to keep starting another flywheel up. Now you can't always do that. Sometimes you have ministerial enthusiasms, and we've got a public servants function within those spaces. But I thought that was an interesting example of some people who'd gone out of their way well ahead of it. No, they hadn't been asked to do that by any minister. I'm sure they negotiated cover to do it, but they set about to get broad agreement about what this commissioning space would look like.